Thank you very much, and thank you, Nina. It was quite an experience. Before launching into this, I did want to mention we gave the Kleptocracy Award last night, which we give to particularly egregious corporate harm to the Zeneca Corporation, now AstraZeneca, $67 billion third largest pharmaceutical company in the world, who gets 50% of its revenues from producing pesticides and fungicides and plastics, and the other 50% from cancer treatment. So we thought that was truly perverse vertical integration, you know. I did want to acknowledge also Catherine Salveson. Is Catherine here somewhere? I can't see anything. And she'll be in the workshop this afternoon. We produced the movie together, and she's a very courageous public health nurse. You know, Hoxsey is really the story of how healing becomes a crime. And it's a very disturbing story, although the story is changing very greatly today in some very optimistic directions, and that's where I'm going to kind of land with it. I realized when I wanted to do this talk that there's no way I can compress this incredibly rich and vastly complex story into 25 or 30 minutes. So what I'm going to do is give you some sort of snapshots. I just want to make a couple remarks to kind of set the context for you, and then I'm going to show you about 10 minutes of the film, which will give you like a little postcard of the Hoxsey history, and then I'll come back and you know, tell you what's going on contemporarily and so forth. In the summer of 1997, 2 years ago, the Federal Office of Alternative Medicine launched a formal scientific review of the Hoxsey cancer treatment, arguably the most controversial alternative cancer therapy in American history. This preliminary government evaluation of Hoxsey, as the treatment is known, signaled a radical departure, a seeming ceasefire in medicine's nearly 75-year crusade against this alleged, quote, cancer quackery. The American Medical Association, which had been Hoxsey's medical nemesis, crystallized the medical establishment's passionate opposition to Hoxsey 40 years ago in an editorial in the AMA Journal, and this is what they said at that time. It is fair to observe that the American Medical Association or any other association or individual has no need to go beyond the Hoxsey label to be convinced. Any such person who would seriously contend that scientific medicine is under any obligation to investigate such a mixture or its promoter is either stupid or dishonest. Paradoxically, this long-standing condemnation is not based on the objective scientific evidence that determines the acceptance or rejection of medical theories or therapies. Instead, its dismissal typifies the kind of pre-factual conclusion that has characterized organized medicine's century-long exclusion of so-called unconventional cancer treatments from the medical playing field. Today, very substantial data exist that indicate that indeed the Hoxsey herbs do have strong anti-cancer properties. Thousands of patients believe it has saved their lives. Numerous judges, and in fact there's no dispute, as you'll learn later, that the Hoxsey external medicines are effective. Organized medicine stopped protesting that in 1950. But over the course of the century, numerous prominent figures, including senators, judges, federal courts, doctors, have affirmed that there is something going on here and have repeatedly called for an investigation. Why then has this taken so long? The answer is encrusted in medical politics. A medical civil war has been raging whose murky depths are opaque to most people. It revolves around a fierce trade war and also a deep philosophical conflict of medical opinion. Its consequence has been the exclusion or outright suppression of numerous promising therapies, including Hoxsey. And today that war may be at a historic turning point, where yesterday's quackery is emerging as tomorrow's medicine. The Hoxsey story really, what's important about it is it's a revelatory microcosm of these medical politics, as well as their age-old roots. And this journey through the shadow side of medical politics actually raises very disturbing questions. If there were unorthodox treatments for cancer, would doctors even know about them? And by refusing to investigate such treatments, has organized medicine denied countless people access to potentially life-saving therapies? And finally, who has the ultimate choice to decide what patients want to use, especially when facing life-threatening illnesses for which conventional medicine often has little or nothing to offer? And as Sam, explained, the disturbing context here is that the medical establishment has largely lost its celebrated war on cancer. We would not even be having this conversation if it were otherwise. But what has remained hidden from most people is the existence of this other cancer war, the one against alternative therapies. And with the story of Hoxsey that you'll see, there have been about 100 of these over the course of the century, more than a few of which appear to hold very, very significant promise, though none of them is a magic bullet cure-all, and I don't in any sense want to mislead people in that regard. But what the facts clearly reveal is that there's a consortium of interests consisting against unorthodox treatments, which have essentially condemned them without investigation. This includes the AMA, the Food and Drug Administration, the National Cancer Institute, the American Cancer Society, and several large corporations which profit greatly from the cancer industry. And I do want to make it clear, by the way, that this is not doctors that are doing this by and large. Organized medicine are medical politicians for the most part, and doctors have suffered often as greatly as patients in having their own freedom to either research or administer these treatments curtailed. They are also under the gun. They usually lose their licenses if they look in the wrong directions. We all know, as Sam explained, that cancer has reached epidemic proportions and the death rate has continued to climb. But what has continued to climb also is the cancer industry. It is very, very big business. In this country alone, it's $110 billion a year, right? It's 10% of the entire healthcare budget. And cancer treatment is now the dominant specialty of American medicine. And cancer is poised now to actually surpass heart disease as the leading killer in this country. Hoxsey's often been called the wildest story in medical history. And I'd like to now just show you two clips of the film. I had to get it on separate tapes, so the first one is a couple minutes and the second one is about 8 minutes, and there's just going to be a very short lag while we change the tapes. But anyway, it gives me great pleasure to do this. I have a captive audience, so. And it is truly the wildest story in medical history, so here's a few minutes of the Hoxsey movie. Hopefully.
Do it.
He was doing his thing, and he had no business doing it.
Can we drop the house lights?
Hoxsey met both the legal and the dictionary definition of a quack. One who pretends to medical skill which he does not possess.
It was easy for the medical profession to paint Hoxsey as a quack. He fit the image perfectly.
This book, entitled You Don't Have to Die, is filled with dynamite. In fact, it should have been printed on asbestos paper. I give you names, times, dates, names of doctors, names of institutions.
The doctors labeled Hoxsey the worst cancer quack of the century. But Hoxsey's supporters called him an effective healer, persecuted by a medical trust.
But up to now, they have never proven that this treatment don't cure cancer.
The ex-coal miner with an 8th grade education became a legend in his own time. According to the Hoxsey legend, the remedies were discovered by his great-grandfather experimenting on a sick horse. Hoxsey said his father was the first to try the medicines on people. He gave young Harry the formulas with a deathbed wish to make the treatment available to people whether or not they could pay. He insisted it carry the Hoxsey name. Prophetically, he warned the boy against the high priests of medicine who would fight him jealously. It didn't take long. Hoxsey started his first clinic in Illinois in 1924, and he immediately incurred the wrath of organized medicine. He was arrested more times than any other man in medical history. Yet by the 1950s, the Hoxsey Clinic of Dallas, Texas was the largest privately owned cancer center in the world. Hoxsey clinics reached through 17 states. Endorsing the treatment were senators, judges, and even some doctors. 2 federal courts upheld its therapeutic value. If the treatment was worthless, how did it gain so much support? To claim a cure for cancer is to invite evaluation. While the medical profession turned its back on Hoxsey, numerous individuals did make personal investigations. These experiences repeatedly turned skeptics into believers.
And also that they had a renewed sense of hope for the future.
But a new cancer treatment needs more than personal investigations to gain acceptance. It needs a formal scientific review.
And when I say to you, all I want is to have them come here. The American Medical Association, the Pure Food and Drug, the federal government, anybody, come here and make an investigation. And if I don't prove to them beyond any question of a doubt that our treatment is superior to radium X-ray and surgery, then I will lock the doors of this institution forever.
The medical establishment, if you will, felt that any effort on their part to either go and review the work or the material that Mr. Hoxsey might present to them would do little more than give credibility to the program and would not, in fact, accomplish anything meaningful.
The doctors claim that they already knew from their medical education that his remedies were had no efficaciousness at all, was no cure. They were just set in their ways and adamant in their beliefs.
He's like all the rest of them. They all say they're treated unfairly, that medicine won't pay attention to them. And it's true, because medicine doesn't, or does know, that their products are worthless.
According to Hoxsey, there was a more sinister reason the medical profession wouldn't investigate. His early fame in Illinois had soon reached the nearby Chicago headquarters of the American Medical Association. Hoxsey said the AMA doctors invited him to demonstrate the treatment. Among them was Dr. Morris Fishbein, editor of the influential AMA Journal. The alleged test case was a terminal cancer patient, Police Sergeant Thomas Mannix. According to Hoxsey, the day after his successful demonstration, a high AMA official asked to buy the rights to the formulas. The alleged offer would have given all rights to a group of doctors, including Dr. Fishbein. Mildred Nelson recalls Hoxsey's version of the story.
And they were in the process of drawing up the contract and everything, that they would take the formula. And he said, you have to put in here that no one can be turned down because of the lack of funds. And they said, oh no. And he said, yes, this is a promise I made my father on his deathbed. This must go in it. You have nothing to do with this. We'll charge what we want to. And he said, you can't. You have to keep it in reach of everyone. This must be done. And they said, no, we'll charge what we want to and treat who we want to. You have nothing to say about it. He said, well, then you don't get the formula. And that's when the battle started and went for the rest of the years of his life.
Did AMA doctors try to suppress a cancer cure they couldn't control? Hoxsey's shocking charges became shrouded in unprovable mystery when the AMA denied the entire incident. Evidence confirms only the medical case, not the circumstances. But one thing was certain. Hoxsey had made a very powerful enemy. By crossing swords with Dr. Fishbein, he alienated the most influential figure in medicine. Dr. Fishbein held a unique position. As journal editor, he controlled the main income-producing organ of the AMA and thus the organization. He also published the accepted standards of medical practice. After the Chicago incident, Dr. Fishbein blackballed Hoxsey by branding him a quack in the journal. But he went even further. The journal accused him of using brutal external pastes that ate fatally into patients' blood vessels. It commented that Hoxsey's most enthusiastic supporter was the local undertaker. The AMA attack was relentless. Dr. Fishbein and Hoxsey would battle each other for 25 years to come in a drama of national dimensions. But rather than settling the dispute through scientific means, they played it out in the media.
At the association's headquarters in Chicago, vigilant against quackery is Dr. Morris Fishbein.
There is no serum, drug, or combination of drugs that we know that will definitely cure cancer.
Hoxsey competed for public attention to gain an investigation. He became a master of publicity, promoting his reputed cures far and wide. His stock in trade was the patient testimonial. When he gained access to an Iowa radio station, his testimonials reached millions. Owner of radio station KTNT was Norman Baker, who also provided Hoxsey with a large clinic. Baker was a catalog salesman and former stage hypnotist of unsavory reputation. Hoxsey's provocative broadcasts to bust the medical trust soon drew 300 patients a day. Among them was his most fantastic case. The top of Mandus Johnson's skull was rotting flesh, and rumors circulated that he had already died. But in front of 32,000 spectators, Hoxsey performed the resurrection of Mandus Johnson. Hoxsey and a doctor removed the now dead tumor that composed the top of Johnson's skull. Johnson would live on for 30 years and credit Hoxsey with his miraculous cure. Even this spectacle of publicity did not get Hoxsey an investigation. Instead, it drew an angry blast from Dr. Fishbein in the Journal. The next night, gunfire sprayed KTNT during Hoxsey's broadcast. He charged Dr. Fishbein with ordering his destruction, but again he had no proof. Soon their battle would reach federal levels. When Hoxsey approached the National Cancer Institute for an investigation, the agency refused. The NCI said his medical records were incomplete. Hoxsey said doctors refused to supply necessary records because of Dr. Fishbein's influence. The government concluded it would be a waste of public funds to investigate. Having struck oil in Texas, Hoxsey offered to pay for a test himself. His challenges were putting Dr. Fishbein under public pressure, and the doctor fought back hard in the public arena. But when he wrote blood money for the Hearst Sunday papers, he went too far.
Fishbein said, like a ghoul feasting on the bodies of the dead and the dying. And that is why Mr. Hoxsey sued Dr. Fishbein.
Hoxsey sued Dr. Fishbein and the Hearst newspaper empire for libel and slander. He didn't seem to stand a chance. The nation's most notorious faced a who's who of American medicine. Surprisingly, Harry Hoxsey became the first man ever to win a judgment against Dr. Fishbein and the AMA.
So, oh gosh, I can't see anything. Can we bring the house lights up too? It's blinding up here. Hold on one second. There we go. So in the trial with Dr. Fishbein, which Hoxsey won, he was the first person ever labeled a quack to win a judgment, a libel judgment against the AMA. It turned out that Dr. Fishbein, whom they had done a lot of digging on, had failed anatomy in medical school, never completed his internship, and never treated a patient or practiced a day of medicine in his entire career. So if Hoxsey was practicing medicine without a license, Fishbein was practicing license without medicine, I think. In the midst of Hoxsey's battle, there was actually a whole slew of very similar experiences, but the other practitioners were almost entirely not lay people. They were very highly respected MDs and MD PhDs with very high positions, you know, at universities and so forth, but one after another had the identical experience, including a very high-placed individual who recounted that he had also been offered money for the rights to his formulas. Extremely respected and impeccable individual. And during this whole process, the son of a senator from New Hampshire, Senator Toby, actually got well from one of these treatments, and Senator Toby tried to get an investigation and ran up against the same kind of opposition. So what he did is he hired a former federal prosecutor, Benedict Fitzgerald, and sent him underground. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing, and sent him into the underbelly of all these cancer politics to try to find out what was happening. And here is what the conclusion of what the very famous document called the Fitzgerald Report, which he titled "A Conspiracy Against the Health of the Nation," and this is what it said. "My investigation to date should convince this committee that a conspiracy does exist to stop the free flow and use of drugs in interstate commerce, which allegedly have solid therapeutic value. Public and private funds have been thrown around like confetti at a country fair to close up and destroy clinics, hospitals, and scientific research laboratories which do not conform to the viewpoint of medical associations." Unfortunately, Senator Toby died unexpectedly, and the next senator who took over the committee was known as Mr. AMA in the Senate. So he suppressed the report and fired Fitzgerald, who went on to become Hoxsey's lawyer after that. But ironically, it had been Hoxsey's victory over Fishbein which brought the House down. The AMA deflected the whole issue to the federal government, to the FDA, which spent the next 10 years in a sort of war of attrition, a war of technicalities. And eventually in 1960, they did shut the last clinic down in the US strictly on legal technicalities. They never disproved the treatment, and they never disputed the fact that the external remedies do work, which we'll get into this afternoon, I think, a bit more. Well, while making the film and going through this extraordinary kind of mind-bending political history, the obvious question is, what are these herbs? Do we actually know anything about this? Because nobody ever investigated this thing. So I ended up in Washington, D.C. with Dr. James Duke, who I'm sure many of you know in the botanical community. He's a pharmacognosist. He studies medicinal plant chemistry. He's one of the most respected individuals in the world. He worked at the USDA at the time, and he set up their entire botanical database for medicinal plants. He worked for many years with the National Cancer Institute on drug discovery from natural product sources, and particularly herbs. Well, he ran a global database search on the Hoxsey herbs, and it turned out that 8 of the 9 herbs have shown anti-cancer and anti-tumor activity under controlled laboratory conditions. Virtually all of them also have a long history of Native American usage for cancer, including several that go back at least 3,000 years. So, and by the way, there's a very interesting statistic. Studies have found across the board that there's a 74% correlation between folk usage and actual therapeutic activity. You know, this is when they actually run screens on these kinds of things. Well, just as we were finishing the movie in 1987, it was like, you know, we were watching a rerun of it on the news every night for what we were seeing on the screen there. And just at that time, there were serial scandals exploding in Washington, D.C., some of which we managed to document in the movie. The AMA was convicted of conspiracy for the 3rd time in the century for restraint of trade after a federal court found it had tried to, quote, destroy and eliminate the chiropractic profession, which, by the way, Dr. Fishbein once called chiropractic, quote unquote, a malignant tumor. This is the kind of mentality. But among the most prominent cases of suppression was Dr. Lawrence Burton. He had been a member in good standing of the scientific and medical community until he took an unorthodox path, and he came up with an immunological treatment that in front of the Science Writers Convention of the American Cancer Society was able to shrink mouse tumors in 15 minutes. And this led to headlines such as 15-minute cancer cure developed in the Associated Press the next day. But after having a clash with the National Cancer Institute very shortly after that, he found his funding evaporating and his work blackballed. And he was so exasperated that he just pulled up stakes and went to the Bahamas, which is outside of jurisdiction of the FDA and so forth. And he just went into self-imposed exile with a clinic there. Very soon after that, a report surfaced from the National Cancer Institute, which was then published in the AMA Journal, that the clinic's blood supplies were contaminated with the AIDS virus. And so the Bahamian government shut the clinic down immediately. Well, the result of this, of course, was that numerous terminal cancer patients who believed that this was their lifeline found themselves stranded. So many of them were from New York, and they ended up in the office of Congressman Guy Molinari from Congress. And they were pleading for their lives. I mean, this was it. And Molinari, who had cancer in his family, was sympathetic, so he agreed to look into this. The story is too long and involved to go into, so I'm going to give you some headlines. But what it led to very shortly was they found that the report of the contamination was false. It was a false positive. The whole thing was an error. And so Burton was actually reopened. But Molinari was infuriated, and he rounded up 40 congresspeople who demanded that there should be some kind of investigation. And what they did is they used the Office of Technology Assessment, which is the research arm of Congress at that time, and is known as a very impartial body, to actually try to look through these treatments and see if indeed there were anything worth investigating. Well, among the people hired by the OTA, because they bring in many consultants from outside to actually write these reports, was a medical historian, Patricia Spain Ward. She was one of the most revered medical historians in the country, and it actually documented almost entirely orthodox medicine. She'd written only one paper about an alternative treatment, which was actually quite critical of it, and that may have been a factor in her being chosen for this. She went into the Hoxsey research believing that, quote unquote, he was the premier quack, the original flim-flam man. Well, what happened was that Ward turned up when she turned in her paper, she included the same compelling botanical data that we had found, supporting the fact that these are anti-cancer herbs with real activity. And she concluded her report by saying, more recent literature leaves no doubt that Hoxsey's formula, however strangely concocted by modern scientific standards, does indeed contain many plant substances of marked therapeutic activity. Whether there's therapeutic merit in Hoxsey's particular formula for internal use remains as much a question today as it was in 1925, despite provocative findings of anti-tumor properties in many of the individual herbs he used. But when the OTA's draft report came out, Ward's data was entirely absent. But instead, they had put in data from the National Cancer Institute that was unpublished, did not exist in any database, that showed that they had no effectiveness in these herbs. Ward suddenly found herself charging the very same suppression that she had formerly ridiculed and believed impossible. And she wrote, "Rhetoric such as Fishbein's has done much to set the low level of discourse in the emotional rather than analytical tone that has characterized the American medical profession's response to unorthodox remedies." Well, the alternative community was very large and very well organized, and it mobilized around this, and it turned out that other data had been suppressed in other treatments, and particularly the Gerson therapy, and there was a tremendous brouhaha over all this. What ultimately happened was the OTA produced, after 4 years and $500,000, the longest and most expensive report in its history, a report called Unconventional Cancer Therapies, that said, indeed, there is evidence that there may be something of value in a number of these therapies, and these definitely should be investigated. What occurred because of that in 1991 was two senators who founded what has become the Office of Alternative Medicine. And its priority was specifically to look into cancer treatments, although it was much broader than that, to look into alternative therapies as well. And at that time, a national poll, which is never lost on Congress people, by the way, said that over half the American public favored the complete legalization of these treatments. It has been a pretty rocky road since that time, but things are definitely progressing. The OAM was recently elevated to being what's called a national center in the Office of the President of the National Institutes of Health, a very high standing within the government. And its budget has been doubled now to about $50 million, which is not a lot, but not insignificant either. The first two cancer reports that they undertook were in 1997, one of those being Hoxsey. And Catherine participated in this, and we'll talk about it later this afternoon. They sent a team of epidemiologists and researchers to the Tijuana clinic to actually look at a section of patient records and try to track what happened to these people. And we've seen a review copy of the report that will be published, I think, next summer. It's not really public yet. You're hearing it here first at Bioneers. The OAM found striking anecdotal evidence of recoveries by people who got well when they weren't supposed to, including a deadly melanoma case, the average survival time of which untreated is 7 months. The person is 7 years cancer-free and has had no conventional treatment whatsoever. Very, very powerful story. And as a consequence of that, this report is recommending that this treatment should be seriously investigated. There are now actually multiple therapies beginning to get serious clinical investigation. One of those is Dr. Stanislav Brzezinski from Houston. It's a long story that I can't get into, but he was a brilliant MD, PhD, over 200 peer-reviewed papers, high standing in the European Chemotherapy Association. He fled Poland to get away from the communists, but didn't realize he was landing in Texas with the FDA. Took a wrong turn there. But there are 75 clinical trials underway with Dr. Brzezinski now, and the early results are in on several of them. He's famous for treating brain cancer, which is generally incurable by conventional methods unless it's operable. Anyway, there's absolutely early positive data. Two previous court trials have upheld the fact that he has cured terminal brain cancers. The Gonzalez treatment, formerly known as the Kelly treatment, is also under investigation now. It's a very complex metabolic therapy that uses diet and enzymes. It's in clinical trials at Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons. And these trials, and it has extraordinary success against pancreatic cancer reputedly, which also is generally incurable. There's virtually nothing that can be done for this. And these trials are being sponsored by Procter & Gamble. So this is the scale and the level that is going on now. According to the OAM report on Hoxsey, as many as 2/3 of cancer patients are now using alternative cancer therapies. This is off the grid, you have to remember. This is without being able to get information from their doctors, who usually know nothing and often recommend against these treatments. Clearly, the failure of conventional treatments is a factor in this. But the face of cancer treatment in the next 5 to 10 years is going to be virtually unrecognizable, and you're going to see many, many alternative therapies entering the mainstream. I do want to say loud and clear, because I don't want to mislead people in any way, but conventional treatments do save lives. There is no question of this, and it is very important to emphasize that. At the same time, what Dr. Epstein was indicating here is also true. The big criticism of alternatives has been that they're unproven, and so people therefore shouldn't use them. But the truth is that conventional cancer treatments are largely unproven. Both surgery and radiation were essentially grandfathered in without formal clinical trials. And there have been only a few clinical trials around radiation. In 3 or 4 of those, the main ones that have happened, the untreated patients lived longer. And this is not to say radiation does have a place. It is absolutely effective against a very small number of rare cancers. But for the most part, it's unproven and may actually be quite dangerous. Same with chemotherapy, which is unproven, completely unproven against 90% of cancers at least. And they don't even test chemotherapy against a control group, against no treatment. They only test one type against another. So there's really no baseline for knowing what's going on. And in fact, as you may like to know, according to the New York Times, 85% of conventional medical treatments are unproven. There is insufficient data to justify their use according to standard protocols. So this whole thing about, we need an evidence-based medicine, I think, without a double standard. It's only really this century that medicine became big business. Just 100 years, it was diverse, pluralistic, and without financial reward. The real story, the same financial motives of profitability that turned medicine into a very lucrative industry have guided the adoption of official therapeutics in this century. And ironically, that is what has been keeping many of these alternatives out, is financial reasons. But that factor is reversing in favor of alternatives now for a very complex set of reasons. Many of them they're cheaper, for one thing, alternative therapies. They're definitely safer, and many of them, in fact, appear to be effective. Unquestionably, they represent a very large market, and in fact, according to Jane Brody in the New York Times, alternative medicine is the biggest growth sector in healthcare today. By 1997, nearly half of patients were using alternative therapies in a $21 billion market, and the number of visits to alternative practitioners actually exceeded those to primary care doctors. The real crucible, I believe, confronting the acceptance of alternative therapies is the economic matrix onto which they're going to be grafted. What the Hoxsey story is really about is the corporatization of medicine in this century. And today, because a highly concentrated set of giant corporations control healthcare, medical economics are actually in critical condition. And there's tremendous irony. Most of you are old enough to have watched the rise of HMOs. Well, the social architect and health policy guru, Dr. Paul Elwood, who coined the term HMO, was the person who really said, get government out of healthcare, and put this into the private sector. That if we have corporations run this in HMOs, then we're going to have a very efficient and effective medicine. Well, he has, and we're going to control costs. That was his other large argument, of course. So he reversed his position and spoke recently at Harvard this year, where he said he criticized the, quote, unacceptable quality of American healthcare and called for government intervention after all. Part of his turnaround occurred after receiving, quote, substandard care following a life-threatening fall from his horse. It doesn't make any difference how powerful you are or how little you know, he said. Patients just get atrocious care and can do very little about it. So this is the father of HMOs. George Soros, the global investor and philanthropist, has suggested, has suggested that things are not always so clear-cut, has suggested that medicine is a clear case where the market does not work. He has proposed making medicine a not-for-profit enterprise. Making money off human suffering, he suggests, may be an inappropriate arena for Wall Street returns. And in early 1999, in a speech at Columbia University, the philanthropist pledged $15 million for a new program to de-emphasize profit in medical care. And this is what he said: healthcare companies are not in business to heal people or save lives. They produce healthcare to make profits. One of the biggest obstacles in this regard, though, is that herbs such as Hoxsey and other treatments like vitamin C, hydrazine sulfate, cannot be patented. A huge problem, so therefore the companies do not develop them. This whole game is based around patents. Effectively, they become orphan drugs, and no one will, take them on. One observer said, what we really need is a major allocation of taxpayer money from the NIH to be mandated for public interest research that would not generally be funded by the pharmaceutical companies and drug developers. I mean, what do we have a government for? It's supposed to be the public interest. A principal argument against nonprofit healthcare is that there will be no incentive for the pharmaceutical industry to develop these new drugs. In fact, between 1987 and 1991, a feeble 17 major new drugs were developed, and 12 of those were paid for by government subsidy. And as Sam described with Taxol, that was subsidized by the NCI for $32 billion of our money, then given without cost to Bristol Myers Squibb, which sells it at 20 times the manufacturing cost. So this is very questionable. Drug prices in the US are the highest in the world, twice that of the next highest, which is Canada. The pharmaceutical industry has the highest return on investment of any industry. When drug companies justify their exorbitant prices on the prohibitive costs of drug development, about $9 billion a year, which is a lot of money, what they fail to mention is the $10 billion a year they spend on sales and marketing, which is twice that of most other consumer products industries. And then, of course, they spend $74 billion annually on political lobbying. In fact, there's vast turbulence in the healthcare industry today, and the one certainty is that it's going to change very, very greatly. Things are not at all stable. The futurist Clement Bezold has a think tank called the Institute for Alternative Futures, and he predicts very radical changes that favor alternative therapies. Healthcare will be increasingly driven by outcomes, by real documentable results. Patients want less invasive therapies. Mounting environmental concerns will add pressure for cancer prevention. The cost savings of alternative therapies will be a major factor in their growing acceptance, and public health spending will reflect that priority. And medicine will also become much more patient-centered, including the patient's values, beliefs, and subjective responses. Just hold on one sec. Immunotherapies are going to move to the center stage. And finally, freedom of medical choice is going to emerge as a compelling political issue in tune with market economics, patient demand, and a trend toward customization in general. But I think, for cancer patients, above all, this is a human rights issue. And Michael Lerner talked about this yesterday, that he believes that health is going to really emerge as the principal human rights issue of the 21st century, which I think is absolutely correct. Patients feel that they have the medical civil right to use a treatment of their own choosing, especially in terminal cases where conventional medicine has little or nothing to offer. And former Congressman Berkeley Bedell of Iowa, who helped found the OAM, introduced a Senate bill called the Access to Medical Treatments Act, which would allow patients and doctors to select the therapy of their choice based on informed consent. Most patients don't want to forsake conventional treatment. Only 5% or so do that. Most want the best of all worlds, based on reliable data and good information and their own personal affinity and choice. So what we're probably looking at in the longer term is a meritocracy that's really based on, on evidence and what people choose. When Hoxsey defeated Dr. Fishbein in court in 1949, here's what the judge ruled. So I wish to say, pay your money and take your choice. Those who need a doctor, if you think one side is best, go and get him. If you think the other side is best, you certainly have the right to go and get him. This is a free country. This is what we stand for in America. By the way, I did want to say Mildred Nelson, whom you saw in the film, who was Hoxsey's chief nurse in Dallas and then took the clinic to Tijuana in 1963, died last January. And I wanted to honor her. She's an extraordinary healer, kind of a cross between Mother Teresa and Calamity Jane. And the clinic does continue, and there are some competent, experienced physicians there, but there really is no successor, even remotely, like who Mildred was. And a great deal of knowledge was lost with her passing, too. So today, this whole therapy really is poised on the border of extinction. I mean, nobody knows what's going to happen going forward. And the effort of trying to get the medical research going back in this country, which is really what Catherine has been devoting much of her effort to, is the long-term, we hope, the long-term destiny of seeing the Hoxsey treatment come back to the United States where it should be. The end of the story is yet to be written, and we're going to talk about that more later this afternoon. So thank you very much. Thank you.